We're gonna go over the Schara Gambit, a great surprise weapon against the Queen's Gambit, extremely dangerous, an opening that I have faced in my last tournament or 2 tournaments ago. I had the white pieces, I was facing the Schara Gambit, I was confused and scared and afraid that I was gonna lose, and I almost did lose. I ended up winning the game, but I got lucky, and then I played well when I equalized. So this is the Schara Gambit. In the Tarrasch defense. So if you play the Tarrasch, this is a great addition to your repertoire. If you don't play the Tarrasch but play the Queen's Gambit declined against the Queen's Gambit or the Slav or whatever else, you may wish to choose to play the Tarrasch simply because of this. Because after c5, if you turn on the book on Lichess, everybody plays cd5. And in my game, I played this with white. And I knew that there was the option to take on d4, but that's as far as I could remember. I haven't looked at this in years. I didn't even remember the name of the gambit. I didn't know it was a gambit. I didn't know it had a name. So why is cd4 so dangerous and so interesting? During the game, I just thought, okay, well, I take with the queen. I mean, what's the problem here? It's not as simple. Now I'm going to show you the move queen takes d4 first. White also has the option to go queen a4, which I think is superior now that I've actually played that one game. I should mention that that was a classical tournament game, so I had a lot of time to think. So my opponent in this position played knight c6, and this is the point behind the Schara Gambit. You lose time with white with your queen, and I must have spent 20 minutes here. In the end, I played the best move, but I spent 20 minutes trying to figure out all the variations. I was trying not to bring my queen back to d1. That's all I wanted to do. I wanted to play queen g4 or queen a4 or something slightly more active, but I couldn't. The queen needs to go back to d1, and that's the only good move. Now, if you turn on the engine, it will say plus 0.5, plus 0.6, plus 0.7, so not a full pawn for white. In reality, I would say that black's compensation is even bigger than that. I would say that it's easier to play black than white, and that black almost has a compensation for the full pawn. So now, if black doesn't do anything, we are going to take the knight. If the knight moves, we are going to take the pawn, so black must react. For those of you who are just beginning, of course, I cannot take the knight here because my queen is hanging. Black would take my queen. So after queen d1, e takes d5, and this is the pawn sacrifice. This is the Schara Gambit. White can now just take the pawn, and I did take the pawn, just queen takes d5. And in this position, you can go into the Schara Gambit with bishop d7, or you can go into what's called the von Hennig Gambit in the Tarrasch within the Schara Gambit with bishop e6, which is what my opponent played. Now that's extremely rare, but personally, if I have this position with black and I plan to, I'm going to play bishop e6. Now here is why. Even though after a gambit, you normally don't want to trade queens, trading queens here is extremely dangerous for white because the knight has access to the b4 square. Therefore, the knight can attack the c2 square and fork the king and rook. Once the trade happens, so of course I took, there are no alternatives, the rook comes to the d file and my king is completely cut off. So if I'm not careful, I could hang a piece. If somehow this knight disappeared, then bishop b4 would be game over. And black has a very serious threat of going knight b4. Now I have calculated all of this before playing queen d1 during that 20-minute thing. So there are a couple of options here. There is e3, which I later found out was the best move and the main move. And there is what I played, which is slightly inferior, but it should be equal. Bishop to d2. The idea behind bishop d2, and this is a playable move, perfectly playable, although I would advise you to play the main line with e3 if you have the white side of this. If you play black, then you should be happy to see bishop d2, because now you can go knight b4. This is how my game went. And I have decided on my move before I played queen d1. There are 3 options here. Rook c1, king d1, and castle's queenside. Castle's queenside I have discarded pretty quickly. I knew that that has to be bad, because now knight a2 check, knight a2, bishop a2, and my king is completely cut off. If rook c8 comes, I can resign. So, you know, I don't know. I would have to go bishop c3, and then my opponent can play bishop b4, and it's over. So knight b4, the best move, which I didn't play, is rook c1, giving up a pawn. And if you have black in this position and you turn on the engine, it's plus 0.5. It's no big deal. So you take, and take. White is okay, for sure. Black is supposed to be slightly worse, and white is out of the danger zone because there is no knight, there is no queen. However, if this is the worst case scenario, you have a 2-to-1 pawn majority on the queen side, which looks very promising later in the game. Now I'll show you my move, because if you end up playing the Schara Gambit, you may actually face this. It seemed very logical to me. I didn't like rook c1 because I didn't want to give up a pawn. So I played king d1, which seems suicidal, but I couldn't find the win for black, and this way I keep my pawn. If I manage to go a3 at some point, and I'm not losing to bishop b3 check, if I don't lose to bishop c5, bishop e3 at any point, losing my bishop, then okay, the queens are off the board, I'm not going to get mated. Now here you can do a couple of things with black. My opponent played knight f6, which I think is the critical move. I went e4. If I can play bishop b5 check, I'm fine. I'm out of the danger zone completely. So my opponent played a6. And now I thought, okay, knight g4 is now coming. So, you know, let's defend the pawn. Let's prevent knight g4. I went f3. And this is fine. My opponent played bishop c5. And now I have to prevent bishop e3 because I'm going to lose the bishop. So king c1 is forced. Absolutely forced. And my opponent castled. And the game went on. I ended up playing bishop e2, bishop d1, knight e2, trading off the pieces, consolidating and winning a pawn up endgame. And after I developed my pieces, it was extremely easy and I just won the game. So bishop d2 is interesting. It's not optimal, it's interesting. The best move, if you play the von Hennig Gambit within the Schara Gambit for white, is to play e3. And this you really shouldn't be afraid of either. It's better than bishop d2 and it's easier to play for white, but black is still perfectly fine. There are a couple of moves here. You can play a6 preventing bishop b5. You can play knight f6, but that's no good because of bishop b5, or you can just go knight b4. Personally, I like a6, and when I get this position, I'm going to play a6, because speeding up white's development by allowing bishop b5 is not a good idea. When you play a gambit and you sacrifice material, it's not just about checkmating your opponent, it's about preventing their pieces from harmonizing and developing easily. So if you don't play a6, if you play knight b4, for example, then bishop b5 comes. And if you play bishop d7 to block that check, you are losing. You are simply losing. Bishop d7 takes, rook takes, white plays king e2, white has a pawn for nothing, you have zero compensation for the pawn, a3, b4, bishop b2 is coming, all of white's pieces are perfect, the knight is coming to f3. The engine says this is +2, that may be an exaggeration, but white definitely has a pawn and better development, easier development moving forward. So if you do go knight b4, on bishop b5 you have to play king e7. And here black is fine because you haven't initiated a lot of trades, but it's still, I'm not a big fan of this. White goes king f1, preventing knight c2 check, and now you continue developing, but your bishop is stuck on f8. So it's not as pleasant. So my recommendation, if you do end up playing the von Hennig within the Schara Gambit, after the queen trade, go a6, e3, a6. And now white has to continue developing, bishop e2. You go knight b4 now, okay? White has to go king f1. And now you can go knight c2 anyway, it doesn't really matter, rook b1, and you continue from there, knight f6, bishop c5, and continue playing the game. This is okay for black. The engine says almost equal. And as I said, After this trade, e3 is the best move, but white still has to be pretty careful. Now, let's look at the alternative that's more popular. This is the actual Schara proper, the way most people play. Bishop d7, declining the queen trade. So you have given up a pawn. Knight b4 now comes with tempo on the queen and targeting c2. So knight f3, white develops, knight f6, chasing the queen away, queen d1. So this is the third time this queen has been on d1, at the start of the game, after knight c6, and now after knight f6. If white goes queen d1, queen out, queen d1, queen out, queen d1, then of course black has compensation for the pawn. Bishop c5. You can see that all of black's pieces are working in almost perfect harmony, except for the queen and bishop on the d file. e3, white has to develop, queen e7, preparing to develop the bishop without allowing the queen trade and preparing to castle queenside. Bishop e2, castles queenside, castles kingside. You could argue that this is the start of the Schara Gambit, and the engine says +1, +1. So if you play bishop e6 instead of bishop d7, you are going to have a better position according to the engine. What's easier for you to play, you have to decide on your own. These positions are much richer, much trickier, and I would like to have these as well. I don't know what to say. Black has one way to continue here. g5. Now this is a real attack, and the pawn cannot be taken. If the pawn is, excuse me, if the pawn is taken, white loses straight away. Rook g8. You have to move your knight or defend your knight. The problem is that you cannot move your knight. Knight e4 loses the knight. Knight h3 loses the knight due to bishop takes h3. Knight f3 loses the knight or the game, as we are going to see in a second. The best move is e4, but now just chase the knight away anyway. And after the knight goes to f3, bishop h3 is the end of the game. The queen is attacked, g2 is attacked. The best move is to give up your queen and, well, resign. So on g5, this pawn really cannot be taken. So what does white do? Most people with white, if you turn on master games, most people, 62%, have played b4, which is a bad move, giving up a pawn with tempo on the knight in order to speed up queenside development. The second most popular move is a3, which also isn't too optimal. If you turn on the Lichess database, the majority of the people, 43%, have played b4, and then a3 is the second most common, followed by knight d4. a3 should be the best engine move, but it's a bit too slow. You can also go queen c2, or b3. Let's stick to a3. Let's see what black should do if white plays the best moves. We played g5, so we go g4. One more thing I want to point out, for those of you who are just starting out, preventing g4 with a move like h3 would be immediately losing, because you're not losing material, but you're giving black a double attack on h3 and f3. So after something like rook h to g8, there really is no way to fight against g4. So queen c2, g4, and now the point is the files are going to open up. And if you take the pawn, the g file is open. If you move the knight, I take on h3, and the g file is once again open, and your king is naked. So on g5, a3. Black played g5, so let's go g4. Okay, the knight has to move away, and I actually studied this position a lot because I was preparing for white and black, because now this is going to be in my repertoire with both sides. Knight h4 is the best move, although knight d2 is perfectly playable and knight d4 is okay. But knight h4 is best. And the idea behind knight h4 is to go queen c2, followed by knight f5 if needed. Firstly, that blocks the bishop. Secondly, it gains the tempo on the queen, and it also prevents rook g7, rook g8 in some cases. Black's best, I think, here is bishop d6, although most people play king b8, which is fine. Just getting the king away from the c file and preparing rook c8 if queen c2. So queen c2, rook c8. That's the idea. White has no good squares for the queen, so this idea of king b8 and rook c8 is very dangerous because the queen and rook are lined up. b4, why we played a3 as white, bishop d6, bishop b2, and now there are a couple of options. I mean, you can go queen e6, trying to fight for the f5 square. I like that. You can go bishop e5, trying to fight against this bishop down the diagonal. You can go h5, which is also okay. White should be better in all these lines, and black really shouldn't have anything if black is playing against an engine. If black is playing against a human, I would seriously consider taking black here, if I had to choose. All we have to do now is somehow secure the f5 square and chase the knight away. That would be my attacking goal. It's hard to accomplish, but still. There could be some tricks with knight b4 if the knight moves, or knight d4. Maybe the knight comes to e5 and f3 with rook g8. There are so many attacking ideas, whereas white really doesn't have any. Okay, the engine says 0.9 because it knows white is a pawn up and sees the defenses to all the tricks. So in short, the Schara Gambit in the Tarrasch is a wonderful opening. If you face the Queen's Gambit, consider playing the Tarrasch just because of the Schara Gambit. So takes, and you take on d4, giving up a full pawn. Now, before I forget, Queen a4. Why is Queen a4 superior? This is the second most, excuse me, popular move. But the point is that you provoke bishop d7. Why is this important? The bishop on d7 prevents knight c6. So once we take on d4 now, knight c6 simply loses a knight. And knight c6 doesn't work. So in this case, e d5 once again, and you can see that the queen trade hasn't happened. We can once again take on d5, knight c6, knight f3, and after knight f6, our queen goes back to d1, but we have saved one tempo with the queen. And once again, we transpose to the position with bishop d7, e3, queen e7. We are now in the same position as before. Castle's queen side, castle's king side, and of course, g5. So if you want to avoid the von Hennig bishop e6, but within the Schara Gambit, which of course as white you would like to do, limit yourself to one gambit, then play queen a4. That's the advantage of not taking on d4 straight away, which I failed to appreciate during my game. So I have one game in the opening and I won the game, perfect score. I want to see how I do with black when I play that gambit. Thank you for watching. I hope you got something from the video. Stay tuned for more chess. Bye bye.